President Berman, Rabbi Goldwick, Dr. Sampson, distinguished faculty, trustees, and guests, ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, Mom. Thank you for the honor you do me with this degree. I'd like to think that somewhere in the great upstairs, my rabbinical forebears from Vilna are smiling on this occasion. My topic this evening is the future of the United States, or, as some of my more pessimistic friends in the Never Trump camp are prone to frame the question, what future? It is prompted by the reflection that tonight is the 93rd year for this event, and thus by a sense of curiosity about where the world might be 93 years hence. I hope that my youngest child will have just celebrated her 101st birthday. I also predict that the Jets will be no closer to winning the Super Bowl. What about the rest of America? Let us suppose that it is the year 2110 and a history professor at Yeshiva's business school is asking her students to name the inventions or innovations that defined the economic terms of the early 21st century, much in the way that airplanes, the Model T, and penicillin defined the 20th century, or the steam engine and locomotive defined the 19th. What answers might her students give? Let me suggest three. The first is what we usually call fracking. A decade ago, it was fashionable to claim that the world was running out of oil and that the United States was mostly a bystander when it came to energy markets. Yet today, the world produces more oil than ever, and the US is again the world's #1 energy producer in both oil and natural gas. Fracking has meant we could sanction Iran's energy markets and barely feel the consequences at the pump. It has helped the US achieve the greatest reduction in carbon emissions of any country as we switched to natural gas from coal. Instead of living in a limits to growth era of diminishing possibilities, as the doomsayers of the 1970s believed, it turns out that we are in an era of energy superabundance in which the United States is again the global leader. Here's a second innovation few of us could have imagined: mobile apps. If you had used the term mobile apps just a decade ago, hardly anyone outside a few computer labs would have known what you were talking about. It is now a $100 billion industry and a ubiquitous feature of our lives. It has challenged long-standing urban monopolies, created job opportunities for hundreds of thousands of marginal workers, changed the way we deliver and get the news, and will revolutionize everything from the way we eat pizza to medical diagnoses. Finally, we might add, for a third innovation, gene therapies to the list. A century ago, the great killers were diseases such as tuberculosis and pneumonia. 46% of Americans in 1910 died of infectious diseases, as opposed to just 3% today. A half century ago, in the late 1960s, heart disease was the great killer. But here, mortality rates have also come down thanks to improvements in medicine and changes in lifestyle. Instead, as we live longer, cancer has become the great killer. Now, suddenly, the advent of gene therapies has opened the prospect that many cancers and diseases, such as multiple sclerosis, may be manageable or curable after all. Though we are still at the touch wood stage, it is no longer far-fetched to imagine a horizon where many more of us will push through the diseases that now get us in our 60s, 70s, and 80s so that we can live healthy lives, at least until we all die of dementia sometime early in our second century. and this too will transform societies for the better. Now, all of these innovations, and many others we could mention, from driverless cars to artificial intelligence, have downsides and risks. So does every other significant innovation in history, starting with fire and the wheel. Let me set that debate aside for now to make a more simple observation. To wit, fracking, mobile apps, and gene therapies are revolutions that by and large were made in America, not in Russia or Japan, the former countries of the future, not in China, the current country of the future, not even in Brazil, the perpetual country of the future. They happened in the US. And so the interesting question is, why? Every good teacher knows a great education depends on asking the right questions. Since we are living in a time in which the President of the United States has made an issue of American greatness, it behooves us to ask, well, just what is it that makes a country great? I would argue that the answer depends on how, as a country, we choose to answer a few simple questions. So allow me to propose 4 questions of my own. The first question is, how do we treat foreigners? Another way, a more academic way of putting that question is to ask, what is our attitude toward human capital? Do we recognize its inherent value and potential? Or do we tend to see people, especially immigrants, as liabilities, potential criminals, additions to the welfare rolls, threats to our cultural integrity, would-be terrorists, and so on? Because the subject of DACA has been in the news in the last few months, I've done some research on this subject for my column. A few findings. Did you know that immigrants account for 35% of all US Nobel Prize winners? Did you know that 83% of finalists in the 2016 Intel Science Talent, often called the Junior Nobel Prize, are the children of immigrants? Did you know that 40% of all Fortune 500 companies, accounting for $4.8 trillion in revenues and 19 million employees, were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants? Did you know that immigrants start businesses at about twice the rate of other Americans? Did you know that without immigrants, we would have had 0 population growth since 1970, putting us on a path to a Japanese-style demographic death spiral? It is, of course, true that immigrants put strains on their host societies. It is true also that in any immigrant population, there will be thieves, killers, rapists, scallywags, and layabouts, though, by the way, did you also know that the incarceration rate for illegal immigrants is half that of US citizens? But the important question Americans must ask themselves isn't whether there aren't liabilities. There are. It's whether the liabilities aren't vastly outweighed by the benefits. Do we see newcomers as an opportunity and our welcoming of them as deep evidence of our abiding faith in our founding American creed, created equal? That's the first question on which American greatness, I believe, depends. The second question is, what is our attitude toward independent thinking? It is no secret that it is becoming increasingly difficult to express a controversial thought in the United States today. A software engineer at Google writes a well-researched memo politely suggesting that the company is going about its gender diversity policies wrong, and he gets fired. Football players take a knee during the national anthem to protest what they see as racial injustices in society, and the vice president walks out on them. A liberal professor at Evergreen State College objects to student demands that all white people leave campus for a day, and he is hounded from his job. Oh, by the way, a center-right columnist at the New York Times delicately suggests that perhaps we should be less than 100% confident about our global warming predictions, and 40,000 people signed an online petition demanding that he be fired. All this has been accompanied by multiple efforts on campuses and in corporate life to criminalize or aggressively marginalize certain types of speech in the name of such worthy goals as civility and inclusiveness. But what begins as soft censorship rarely ends there. What starts as an effort to deter outrageous speech will inevitably have the effect of quashing genuinely original thinking. Just as the path to scientific discovery is a matter of trial and error, so too the road to an original idea, a great book, or a transformative social movement will always be littered with foolish thoughts, indelicate statements, and all kinds of verbal rubbish that may offend all kinds of powerful people. The United States has always been a land of invention, technical, political, and social, because it has given wide latitude to foolish thoughts and indelicate statements whose ultimate value may not be immediately apparent. And we have thrived because we have a cultural disposition in favor of the gadfly, the contrarian, the upstart, the entrepreneur, the late bloomer, the disruptor, the activist, the social nuisance. We have an inner sense that ripe fruits always start as sour ones, and so we nurture them. This is not how it is done in China, with its explicit censorship and prescribed opinions. It is not how it is done in much of Asia, with its suffocating deference to the opinions of elders. It is not how it is done in parts of Europe, with its polite political fictions. But it is how we have done it in the US, which is why we've been able to maintain a national edge in the think different category. And the question is whether we can maintain that edge, knowing at some deep level that it is our tolerance for the opinions that offend us most that is the most vital ingredient in the perpetuation of our national institutions and our national greatness. The third question is, what is our attitude toward failure? Many years ago, the great historian Bernard Lewis made an important observation about the fate of nations. Quote, "When people realize things are going wrong, there are two questions they can ask," he wrote. One is, what did we do wrong? And the other is, who did this to us? The latter question leads to conspiracy theories and paranoia. The first question leads to another line of thinking. How do we put it right? Lewis was writing about the Middle East. Why are so many countries in that part of the world such failures? Why have they squandered their national energies on hating their neighbors instead of thinking a little more critically about their own behavior? What might Syria or Libya or Iraq have looked like today if they had respected their Jewish citizens instead of scapegoating them, both out of appreciation for their contributions and as a mark of tolerance for other ethnic or religious minorities? There is, of course, a point at which self-criticism can become neurotic, paralyzing, and perversely self-satisfied. But it is also true that individuals, communities, and nations that habitually ask, what did we do wrong instead of who did this to us, are also the individuals, communities, and nations that, in the long run, thrive. Lately, I've wondered, in which camp do we Americans fall? For many years, there has been a grievance culture on the left with a talent for turning statistical inferences into allegations of systemic biases and treating every bad personal habit as a syndrome beyond the control of moral discipline. But now that's been joined by a grievance culture of the right, which seems to think that every factory closure in Ohio is the result of devious trade negotiators in Beijing, and that everything else that's wrong in the world is the fault of Goldman bankers, Beltway cucks, and the fake news media. This is a turn that can only be described as un-American. For generations, one of our advantages over our competitors in Europe and Asia is that we have a greater tolerance for personal or business failures. We're a country of second chances. But tolerance for failure has to be predicated on an acknowledgement of failure, a sense that we must first blame ourselves before we can hope to do better. Do we still have that sense as Americans? That's the third question. My fourth and final question is, what is our attitude toward global leadership? This year marks the 70th anniversary of what has come to be known as the Truman Doctrine. That doctrine put an end to our disastrous national experiment in blind and self-defeating isolationism by promising that America would come to the economic and military aid of embattled nations facing insurgency or aggression. In the following year, Truman came to the military rescue of a blockaded outpost of freedom, West Berlin, and he came to the moral rescue of another embattled outpost of freedom, Israel. In both cases, as later in our defense of South Korea, Truman put our national values ahead of our immediate interests. He didn't ask, what do we get out of this deal? He asked, what is right? How extraordinary have been the material and strategic dividends of each of those investments in moral principle. By saving Berlin, Truman created an outpost of liberty and prosperity that in time became the world's most visible rebuke to communism and, not by accident, the scene of its demise. By saving South Korea, he rescued its people from the Orwellian despotism that rules on the other side of the 38th parallel. And by recognizing Israel, he gave Jewish civilization a chance to reclaim our roots, the Jewish people the possibility to stand up against our enemies, and a Jewish democracy the opportunity to wrestle with and perfect ourselves. For America, the dividends have been even greater. We have had 70 years of unparalleled material prosperity and technological advances, 70 years of global leadership, 70 years without a great war. And we have been able to do it because, for all of the vicissitudes of the Cold War and globalization and the war on terrorism, Americans have broadly understood that great nations, like great institutions and great citizens, lead by example, by inspiring rather than coercing loyalty, by a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, by steadfastness of purpose and evenness of temperament, and by the understanding that a policy of magnanimity and benevolence will, if nothing else, instill the self-respect we need at times of adversity. That is the world America made, as my friend Robert Kagan put it a few years ago. And yet this, too, seems to be under threat, thanks to an economically transactional and morally blinkered species of a foreign policy whose only question seems to be, what's in it for us, and which would trade all that we have gained, all of our idealism, for a mess of pottage. And that's the fourth question. Do we understand that our greatness ultimately depends on putting our values first, on defining our interests according to our values, rather than, in the style of every fallen empire, defining our values according to our interests? So those are my four questions. How we answer them matters a great deal to how we fare as Americans in the future. It is a responsibility that rests especially heavily on the shoulders of educators, because the questions I am asking are only secondarily about policies over which honorable people can disagree. They are primarily about habits and virtues of mind and character, about hospitality and openness, about intellectual independence and tolerance, about forgiveness and responsibility, about magnanimity, courage, and fair play. I believe a university such as Yeshiva, with its proud embrace of religious wisdom and secular knowledge, can meet that responsibility. Not a generation ago, we were the strangers in this land, just as we had ourselves been strangers in Egypt. We know what it means to be the foreigners, and we know how much we have contributed on our road to our American belonging. We are the children of Abraham, the original idol smasher and iconoclast. We know what it is to hold fast to unpopular ideas in the face of opprobrium and persecution, and to see those ideas vindicated in time. We are the people of King David, a man of many flaws. We know what it means to fail and to recover. And we are the followers of Moses, who also put values first as he steered his people through a wilderness to a promised land he would never see. We believe that our morality is a long-term investment whose benefits only our children may reap, but is the wellspring of our self-respect and survival. In short, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have something to teach. In this country, our country, we have been granted the opportunity, the means, the privilege, and even the power to teach it. Let's not miss our chance. Thanks once again for your time and for this magnificent honor. I'll treasure it.